theory following the book Lines, Wheels, Points, and Remedies. Now, if you look at page 9, you see that the top of the page, the heading is the 5 dhatu or elements of traditional Indian Ayurveda and 4 dhatu of Thai Ayurveda. So Thai Ayurveda is not exactly the same as classical Indian Ayurveda. It's not. Okay. For reasons that I discussed earlier, which mostly have to do with the geography of Thailand, being literally in the center of Southeast Asia, heavily influenced by classical Indian and Burmese culture, heavily influenced in the north by Chinese and Laotian culture, heavily influenced on the east with Cambodian and Vietnamese culture, heavily influenced on the south by Malaysian, Indonesian culture, all coming together in Thailand. So although several of the countries that are heavily influential, like Tibet, Bhutan, Nepal, Burma, are Buddhist countries. To the south, toward the Indian side, we have Sri Lanka, which is probably the oldest Buddhist country still practicing a real fundamentalist sort of Buddhism. So there actually are 3 different kinds of Ayurveda in India, for example. There's 3 different kinds. Okay, there is the Hindu Ayurveda, there is the Buddhist Ayurveda, and there is the Muslim Ayurveda. These are the major populations of the continent of India. And unless you really compare and contrast the cultural influence on their practices, then you don't really have a clear overall picture. It's very easy to cherry pick from a few Western resources. People who I know and respect, like Dr. Vasant Lad in Albuquerque, or Mark Halpern in Grass Valley, or John Mumford, or what have you, Deepak Chopra for that matter. It's easy to cherry pick from these sources, or from the popular yoga schools' sort of peculiar explanations and variations of what is Ayurveda, like the Ashtanga school, or the Iyengar school, or the Satchidananda school, or the Friend school, or everybody then in the West also puts their spin on whatever's their particular exposure to it. And actually, in a way, they're all good and useful, and from another point of view, they're all not so useful in that none of them are actually representative of what classical Indian Ayurveda is. And also, what is Ayurveda today in India? What is Ayurveda today in India? And it's quite different than you might imagine. It's quite different. It's just a little preface before we go into the elements. But for example, to be licensed anywhere in India today, to be able to practice Ayurveda as a doctor, you have to be an expert in homeopathy, in Western homeopathy, Hahnemann, Austrian-derived homeopathy. Homeopathy came into India during the late Raj period and was the one medicine, the one system of medical thought that the Indians took to heart right off the bat. They found no controversy, they found no conflict, and they really took right to it because it's all natural remedies. They're vibrationally or essentially energy-based, and they're easily either available or manufactured, and there's no side effects. So the Indian community of Vidya and classical Indian schools of traditional medicine adopted that homeopathy, man. They took it on, and now it is actually a requirement. You have to have the equivalent of a diplomat in homeopathy to be able to take either the national boards or any of the state boards Ayurveda anywhere in India. So if you want to practice Ayurveda in Bengal state, that's the largest state in India, you have to pass a homeopathic board. If you want to practice Ayurveda in Kerala in South India, which is maybe the second, one of the largest states of India, but is one of the most educated states of India. You might not know this little sidebar trivia. If you were to ask the question, where on the planet are per capita, the largest number of individuals with college degrees and the highest literacy rate for reading and writing and essential arts of mathematics and so on, where on the planet would that be? Okay, it's certainly not the United States. Okay, our literacy rate average for the United States is 16 places behind Kerala. 16 places behind. They have more PhDs, more MDs, more doctorates, more master's degrees per capita, per population density than any other place on the planet Earth. And so the body politic is well educated, and they're educated internationally. So many of these people, many of these students who have these advanced degrees went to school in England, they went to Oxford, they went to Cambridge, they came to the United States, they've gone to Harvard, they've gone to Duke University, they've gone to Stanford, UC Berkeley, and UIC in Chicago. And they're internationally educated graduate students. Highest per capita of any population in the world is Carolina. So these people, when they, as a population, when they think about the classical medicine, they don't have any particular issue with incorporating anything new that works and which is amenable to the population. And the beautiful part about it, the Indian government supports this and does not penalize medical doctors who want to adopt alternative or complementary or variant medicines. They don't actually have a problem with that. You're not going to get in trouble, if you do that. So back to what is Ayurveda, and we're talking about more specifically the Thai Ayurveda. Thais have a long history of assimilation and adoption. So there is such a thing as traditional Thai culture, there really is. But the Thais have been very, very quick and very, very adept, and maybe, in my opinion, a little bit too much, especially over the 20 years. It's insane, the amount of adoption of Western culture and so on that you see in Thailand. It's insane compared to 20 years ago. I can go places all over Thailand that are unrecognizable based on the development, based on the dress. When I first went to Thailand, people wore saris and sarongs. You hardly ever see in the country. You have to go way out in the country before you see Thai people wearing saris and sarongs. It's a normal daily life, okay? But everyone, unless you were a Western business person, dressed traditional 25 years ago. Now everybody wears jeans and slacks and t-shirts and button-up shirts and all this kind of thing. So Thais have been very quick to adopt virtually anything. So the Ayurveda is part of traditional Thai culture, but Thai culture is Buddhist. And so the flavor of the adoption, the interpretation of terms is sometimes a little different. Those of you who have other Ayurveda or other yoga training might have noticed when I did the 8 limbs type of thing that there were some little differences, okay? And that is Thai. That's what that is. It's not an aberration. It's been practiced that way for millennia, okay? So it is uniquely the Thai way, all right? And sometimes when we bring in a Western concept like homeopathy, for example, it's classical Ayurveda for the last 50 years, okay? And so you will see it when you go to the countries and practice these things. You will see things that you wouldn't expect. If all you've done is read Deepak Chopra's books or Dr. Ladd's books or Mark Halpern's books or whatever, if that's all you've done, if you go there, you will be shocked at the variety of innovation using modern Western concepts like biologic testing, for example, in Ayurvedic hospitals. Blood test, urine test, using microscopes and dark field microscopy, and that's quite common now in India. But there is much that is similar, and so we still look at it as India as the mother. We still do. And when we talk about here, I'm going to talk about the 5 elements, even though that's not classically Thai, okay? Because Long, which is the air element in Thai Ayurveda, really is, when you consider what is the definition of Long, it is the composite of the effects of ether and air. Composite. So it doesn't violate the 5 element protocol. They're just choosing, as a matter of course, to group 2 of them together that have very, very similar function. Very, very similar, interdependent type of function. So I don't want you to be confused about that. The physical body is composed of 8 ingredients. Okay, just consider this. 3 of them, or gunas, are constitutional. All right, what were the 3 gunas? Remember that? So it was sattvas, rajas, and tamas. All right, those are the 3 gunas of ahankar. In other words, the 3 ways that the ego manifests, or qualities of manifestation of the ahankar, or of the ego, is these 3, they're called constitutional elements. All right, and 5 are elemental. So that gives us 8. Now, that really comes close to being an identical concept with traditional Chinese medicine. And yes, the names of the elements, I was going to say elephants, the names of the elements are slightly different. In Chinese medicine, they're fire, water, metal, water, wood. Okay, so those are the classic elements. But then there are 3 constitutional elements that go with the 5 elements to make up the body, which is, remember the numerology, there's the 8, okay? This is all the constituents of the body. So that 5 and 3 and the 8, see, that is almost exactly the same as in Chinese medicine, as in traditional Chinese medicine theory, or the Taoism theory, okay? And if you do a little bit of history, you find out that there was always commerce between China and India, and that the largest religion of China for many, many years, and many people to the present day, is the bulk of the population are Buddhist. And Buddhism was brought to China by an Ayurvedic physician who was also a monk named Bodhidharma. Bodhidharma, which is kind of a funny name, isn't it? If you understand the words, it means the intelligent man who brought the teachings. And so that's what they called him, was Bodhidharma, right? The knowledgeable person who brought us the teachings. And there's many paintings of him and illustrations, and he supposedly was the original founder of the original school of Shaolin, the temple of Shaolin Buddhism in Wudan Mountain, Sichuan, China. Okay? And then Buddhism spread from there to the whole country, right? He was Indian. He was Indian. And so there was this heavy influence of the Indian Ayurveda on the Chinese culture. And so even what we call classical Chinese medicine, TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, has more in common with Ayurveda than it doesn't. The only thing that really changes are the terms in some of the definitions. But more is common than not. And a lot of people have struggled trying to discern the differences in the 5 elements. What's the difference between ether, air, fire, water, and earth, and fire, water, metal, water, wood? And how they're all different and how they're all the same. No. They're exactly the same. They're just 2 different ways of trying to describe or explain the very same observable phenomenon, which are the elemental constituents of all that there is. Okay? Now let's go on. The constitutional factors are sattvas, tamas, rajas, or sun, moon, and life or shin. Sun, moon, and life or shin. They also correlate with the three forces: first force or active principle, second force or receptive principle, and third force or reconciling principle. Now, that's a correlation right there with traditional Chinese medicine. The first three in Chinese medicine goes like this. So original primordial consciousness, or the Tao, becomes self-reflective, and is distinguished with two primary interrelated aspects called yin and yang. And then in the Nanjing it says yin and yang seek to revolve around each other, and so there's the pivot between yin and yang. So as soon as you take yin and yang, which is essentially dualism, this concept of duality, and you give it a pivot and you spin it, it now has an axis. In other words, it's no longer two forces, it's three, which is the rotation of the axis. And that's the way it described it in the Nanjing. It said they seek to pivot. They seek a pivot, and that becomes the first triune cosmos in traditional Chinese medicine. And out of those three forces, yin yang, and the interaction between them, or the interface between them, everything else is born. Okay, everything else is born. And so it's exactly the same thing that we say here. We have first force, male or yang principle; second force, female or receptive principle; third force, neutral or reconciling or child-like force. And with those three things, with something for them to do. So they're qualities, right? Those forces, they're forces, they're not things. Now we apply those forces to the five fundamental constituents of the universe: materiality, which they're all tamasic elements, okay? So we apply those three constitutional qualities to the material of the five elements, and guess what? Combinations of elements are born. Elements with more energy, elements with less energy, elements with more intelligence, elements with compounds with less intelligence, and then the compounds interact, and then eventually we have everything that there is. And that's how it's described. Let me read you the statement about Om. Okay. Originating out of the cosmic consciousness, the primordial sound Om appears as the first soundless vibration. Out of this vibration comes all of the elemental constituents of the material or manifested universe: ether, Lom; air, prana; fire, Phi; water, Na; and earth, Den. So those are the Thai words, right? Lom, prana, Phi, Na, and Den. Strictly speaking, in the Thai system, we only refer to the total of four elements, as ether and air are combined to form the Lom element. The first of these manifested vibrations is ether, or space. In other words, the primordial Om. Now, I have some interesting thoughts about the primordial sound Om. But honestly, as a disclosure, I'm having to reframe them somewhat in the light of new information. So, and that's not a finished process, okay? But the first one is based on if there was a Big Bang. Okay, so you could title it like you say, if there was a Big Bang. Okay, if there was a time when there was nothing in the universe except for one thing. And that one thing was called the singularity. It was one point of infinite density and infinite energy, but unexpressed. But just one point, literally like less than one molecule big. In fact, they say, what was the singularity? That we can't even define how small the singularity was. Like, was it as big as a grain of sand? Smaller than that? And yet, in that one point, whatever the origin of that singularity, all possible expression of all possible energy and motion and consciousness and space was in that point. And then for whatever reason, that point divided, exploded. We call that point that time place, the beginning of time for us. That's what we call it, the beginning of time, because all time is relative to that point dividing, okay, to the present time. For us, that's our timeline, okay? But if you think about the Big Bang, that's what that dividing is called, the Big Bang, because it created an explosion that was so big that it is still going on. That it created an outward push of propellant motion of various kinds of matter and material that was so forceful. It was 15 billion years ago, okay? Or whatever, trillion years ago, 15 trillion years ago. It was so big that debris from that explosion is still expanding away from it. And of course, while the debris is expanding, it's not passive, it's interacting with other debris. And we call that the formative process of the universe. The formation of cloud clusters and birthing rooms of stars and galaxies and solar systems. That's all just the debris from that explosion, interacting and mingling and attracting and repelling and coalescing and just all the different processes, all going on at the same time to the present time. So it was a very big explosion, and to be honest, it made a big noise. It's impossible to quantify how loud that explosion would have been. In fact, it's so loud that you can still hear it. It's the base resonant frequency of the whole universe. In the absence of every kind of distortion or every other sound that there is that can be identified, there is a sound that stands out, and you can use specific kinds of telescopes which are tuned specifically to sound frequencies. They've isolated approximately what the frequency of this sound is. And if you point that telescope in any direction of the universe, you get this reverberation, you get this echo. And it just so happens that if you hear this sound amplified over a speaker, what you hear is a frequency of the Om sound. That's what you hear. So in my opinion, the Vedas said, originating out of the cosmic consciousness, the primordial sound Om appears as the first soundless vibration. So why is it a soundless vibration? Well, it's like in the science fiction movies, no one can hear you scream in space. Doesn't mean that the vibration is there. Is that what we define as audible sound is based on air. In other words, you have to be in an environment that has air in order to hear things. If you are in an environment which is a vacuum or near vacuum, the vibration of sound does not, the vibrations in space do not manifest as audible sound. Audible sound is an artifact of cochleal, tympanic, auditory nerve interpretation of variations in pressure, waves of energy moving through air. So no air, no ear, no sound. The first and the loudest primordial vibration, which was the carrier wave for creation. The carrier wave for creation. What is driving everything out from the center? Okay, that's the carrier wave. And the ancient rishis said there was such a thing. They said they could hear it. They knew what it was. And they said underpinning everything. If everything is consciousness and vibration, and consciousness affecting material, what drives it? What is the uniform code or pattern that drives its organization? And the rishi said that it was Om. That's what they said. They said it was Om. And that's why we do Oms. Is to remind us and to bring us more in sync with a primordial fundamental rhythm, which has always been part of creation, always been part of the life of the universe, and so therefore it's always been part of every other thing. And when we are out of sorts with the universe, then one of the tools that we're given to bring us into harmony is this mantra, the sacred, which is not really a mantra, is it? Om is not a mantra. Om is what's called a seed syllable. It's a sound. And it's been ascribed meaning, but it's not a mantra. Okay, mantra is a word. Okay, Om is not a word. Om is a tone. Om is a tone. And in Vedic literature, it's referred to as a seed syllable, which makes a lot of sense if you consider all the other parts. And it's incorporated into many other things. Okay. Out of this vibration comes all of the elemental constituents of the material or manifested universe. So first is Om. First is this manifestation of vibration and consciousness. Ether, Lom, air, prana, fire, Phi, water, Nam, and earth, Den. I want you to become familiar with those names. Lom, Phi, Nam, Den. All right, the first of these manifested vibrations is ether or space. Ether or space. So visualize space as empty space for the purposes of getting the hierarchy. So before there was anything, there was nothing. But obviously nothing is something, or there couldn't be anything in it. So ether is space, but it's not empty space. But sometimes it's helpful to think of it like that, because even the singularity that formed the origin of the universe in the Big Bang Theory was in something. It occurred in something, okay? And according to the Ayurveda, it was in the ether, in the pure, undefiled ether, okay? The movement or actions of this ethereal element creates the second air. So in other words, anything that moves or has an inclination to move or has the potential to move in the ether is actually a representative of an air element. Okay? And that's why we usually think of ether as space, and air is that which moves in the space. So if you thought of this classroom, okay, as the opening of the classroom is the ether, but when the air freshener, air purifier is on, you know, it's moving something in this space. Well, we say the movement, what's moving is air. The air condition comes on and you feel the breeze. What's moving, we call air. But it's moving, the air, part of the reason why you can feel it is because of the contrast between no air and air. In other words, when you feel the movement in the air, you know that's something different than space. And so we call that air. You get it? Air, wind, humor, okay? Vapor, all right? So we say air is ether in action. So when the ether is mobile, or has a motility, or has a mobile quality, then we call that air. Now, I also put here, ether is the dark matter of the universe, and actually this is one of the things I'm considering changing, okay? More well thought out theory that's coming out right now out of quantum physics is actually identifying the dark matter, and that what was previously unknown, and that's why it's called the dark matter. We know it's there. In fact, it represents 99% of the material in the universe, which is completely invisible, apparently. We're now seeing it referred to as plasma. As plasma. And plasma is a substance which has a virtually infinite capacity to carry and communicate energy. And so we've identified this substance now called plasma, and the current speculation in quantum physics is actually it is something of this plasma that actually underpins or is the 99% of the universe that we cannot see. Okay? So previously called dark matter, now we're starting to refer to this as plasma. We'll talk about that more another time. the undifferentiated matter or consciousness which is the support of all. Ether is the clear mind of God, or the absolute possibility of all that there is. So it's another way to think about ether. Ether is the mind of God. It is, because it is the underpinning of everything that there is. There is nothing that does not occur in ether. Nothing. So when teachers and sages make these statements, everything is God. Everything is from God. Everything is God. What are they talking about in a material sense? I mean, not talking about a philosophical sense. I'm talking about in an actual practical reality senses, or anything that we can identify that is pervasive to all things in all places, and always was, and apparently always will be. And that is the ether. That is the ether. Okay? It is the hidden element behind everything that ever was, is, or will be. One recent meditation on emptiness, or Zen meditation of Mushin, or Vipassana, can be valuable. In other words, when we do these Zen-type meditations of Mushin and Vipassana, what are we actually really meditating on? We're meditating on all the things that we don't know, all the things we don't see, all the things that are between or behind or above all of the other stuff. So all of the other stuff occurs in something. And in our head, we say it occurs in a field of consciousness which is ruled by past association, cognition, and intellect, and yet it occurs in a field of something which we call the clear mind, or the true mind. The true mind's not subject to all the interference. It's that which abides no matter what comes across the screen. Okay? So these meditations are good for that, because just like doing ohms reminds us and gives us a moment to resonate with something greater than us, okay? And that's why ohms are balancing for the chakras, and that's why, for example, the oldest chakra balancing treatment that I know of is simply sitting and chanting Om while breathing. It's that simple, okay? Because it's a greater field of influence. And so we take our little distortion patterns and subject them to a greater field of influence, and it has a balancing effect. And that balancing effect has been always the same in all times. It doesn't change. What a perfect therapy. I mean, that's a perfect therapy, right? Aside from the fact that I just like to do ohms because they make me happy. It's like how they make me feel. Okay, in the absence of all other dhatu, and dhatu is the five elements, that's the word for the five elements, there is ether alone. And in my notes, I put a question mark. Then is the air God? So in other words, if you actually subtract from the equation all of the known elements, what's left over is ether and air. So in the absence of everything, that which abides, in philosophy context, we say, well, isn't that the definition of God? One of them, isn't it? In the absence of everything else, isn't that what most, you can nod your head, I'm sure you have heard this before, okay? The movement in ether produces friction, which creates heat. This heat, along with air, prana or lom, produces light, or phi. It's from this light that the element fire, or agni, metabolic fire in the body in Ayurveda is called agni, is born. So, when ether moves, movement in ether is air, okay? When this air moves, it creates friction. Creates friction. In other words, and see again, that's how you know ether is not nothing. Because air moving in ether creates friction. The only way that could happen is if what air is moving in has some resistance. The only way it could have resistance is if there's something there to resist. This is how I think about these things. Classically, we're taught that this movement produces friction, and this friction, the evidence of the friction is light. Okay, so light is the first manifestation of fire. Light. So, which came first, the fire or the light? According to the Ayurveda, light came first. So, in other words, fire is a manifestation of certain latent potentials which already have to be present in order for light then to issue once the material is agitated or with friction and set on fire. And so when you make a fire, it doesn't create light, it liberates light that was already in the material. As a result of this intense light and heat, certain particles of the ether dissolved, which we call a process of transmutation, and became as a liquid. So, in other words, as the material moved further from the source, there's this process of transmutation. Another word I could use is condensation. Condensing. In other words, as things expanded to a point, and then as pressure for the expansion ceased to be quite as heavy, various elements were then attracted to themselves, to each other, and began a process of coalescing into proximity. And as they did this, they produced a condensing effect. And out of this condensation, this cooling, we have water. And water is everywhere in the universe. It's one of those fundamental things. One of those fundamental elements of the universe is actually water. Hydrogen is one. Oxygen. There's oxygen everywhere in the universe. There's hydrogen everywhere in the universe. There's water everywhere in the universe. Maybe not as much as here, but there is. In fact, that's the primary technology used to look for habitable, possible Earth-like planets by astronomers, is we know the light frequency of water. And so what they do is tune radio telescopes to look for something that is reflecting that frequency. And that tells them not only that there's water there, it tells them how much water is there. That's the current state of the art right now, looking for planets. There's a couple of different technologies, not the only one. All right. This is the origin of the element water. The water cooled and in solid form became the foundation of Earth. Water became the foundation of Earth. Metaphorically, think lava runs when hot, and when it cools, it becomes solid Earth. Ancient people were familiar with volcanoes. I just put that in there as a little reference, as a reminder. Okay, again, where do five elements come from? Where does the theory of five elements come from? Why would people ever have thought that matter can exist in five different states? And well, we have many natural phenomena that actually mimic all of these stages. And so, for example, a volcano would be what? Volcanoes have a gaseous state. They have a calm state where nothing's happening. They have a gaseous state where they exude volumes and clouds of many different kinds of gases, some visible, some invisible. Carbon dioxide's invisible, sulfur's visible. Okay, and then stuff happens, and what appeared to be solid 1 minute ago becomes something less than solid. And if the largest thing on the planet can, in a moment, become less than solid, as far as an ancient people might be concerned, my guess is they would have thought that everything has that capacity. In other words, if the mountain can turn to liquid and gas, what cannot turn to liquid and gas? If the earth can become fluid and then become solid again, what cannot become fluid and solid again? If solid, cold earth can become fiery, fluid, liquid, and run about, what cannot? What does not have a fiery element? So just when we think about just the volcano alone, I could probably come up with other illustrations, depending on where you are on the planet. We know, for example, probably people have been boiling water for a long time. This process of boiling water. There are all kinds of ways to boil water without a pot. Okay? For example, you could take an animal skin, literally, just any kind of hide, leather, what have you, fill it with water, put it over a fire, and the animal skin won't burn. It'll boil the water. Okay? You can take an animal skin, fill it full of water, or not even do that. You can find a shallow place in a rock, fill with rainwater. You can heat up stones in a fire and throw them in the little pocket of rainwater, and that water will boil. Okay? People have been boiling water for a long time for cooking, and it's really useful in making tools that require animal sinew and glue extracted from animals and things like that. It's really helpful being able to boil things. It's helpful in making certain kinds of wood crafts, being able to, if you steam the wood, it gets very pliable. You can make it into different shapes and they stay there after the wood cools. Okay? So they would have been familiar with this idea that water is water, but when you add some stimulation to it, a heat source, the water gets more, develops a life, a movement on its own. It starts to move on its own. In other words, if water in a crucible just kind of hangs out. Okay, it does take completely the shape of whatever is in it, which is kind of an interesting thing. In fact, it's kind of the only thing that really does that completely. Okay? It's part of its memory function. All right? But then when I add heat or friction to it, the water in and of itself, by itself, starts to move. We call that a rolling boil. All right? And then just after it becomes moving, okay, the water seeks to escape the container and run away. And we call that steam. And once the certain amount of the water has escaped from the heat, okay, the light, the heat, the fire, it actually turns into vapor and disappears and becomes air. And if we did this practice in part of the world that's a little bit more northern, where things would occasionally freeze, we know that water has one other state, and that's where water becomes hard as earth. And in fact, there's a great large part of the world, and certainly 10,000 years ago, that was about 80% bigger than it is now, the glacial period. The last glacial die-off of the Michigan Glacier in North America, which left the Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, Lake Superior, Lake Erie, okay, was only 10,000 years ago. So there were active cultures around the world, like the Sumerian culture, that were well developed in operation at the same time that there were mammoth elephants roaming where we're sitting right here in southern Florida, central Florida. Isn't that crazy? Okay. Those people would have been familiar with all the states of water, and they would have known in the glacial period that water is very much earth. A glacier does not, you don't get on top of a glacier and think it's less solid than being on solid ground. You would never think that. If you're on top of the glacier, you're on the ground. It's hard. You know, certain glaciers are 10 miles thick. You think 10 miles thick of solid ice might not be a little sturdy. You know? Earth. So they have earth element in water, and the fluid, which is the movement principle, the solid movement principle in water, okay? They had the fire principle. Fire was important because fire is the state of the water. Whatever state it was in was completely dependent on the element fire, how much or how little. No fire, water very solid. Lots of fire, water turns to air. Fire is the linchpin to this life of the water. They would have known that. And so just, you could pick like the volcano illustration. Ancient peoples were familiar with volcanoes. They have very dramatic examples of how solid earth would become fluid and have movement where the ground, just even in an earthquake, in a 7.0 or greater earthquake, the ground has perceivable waves. Perceivable waves. Earthquake doesn't just jumble. It doesn't. Okay? When earthquake is moving through the ground, it moves through the ground just like the waves at the ocean move toward the beach. Earthquake waves move across the landscape, and the landscape goes whoa, 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 as the wave moves through the ground. The ground becomes fluid and conducive to the movement of the energy through it. It's not solid at all in respect to that. What causes earthquakes? Changes in pressure, changes in the various alignments of mantles, platelets, and so on. What causes all those distortions? Heat, fire. Fire is the source of earthquakes. Magma, movement in magma, movement in the liquid fire that is around the center of the earth. And so the ancients were pretty observant people. They would have caught on to some of these things. Big example, earthquakes, volcanoes, all 5 elements right there. Okay. Little example, handleable, and also seasonably variable. They would have got the same transitions that my water goes through in my cooking pot happen seasonally. Exactly the same. When it warms up, the water becomes fluid and then goes away. And when it cools off, it becomes fluid again and becomes hard again, and just like it does in my pot. And so all of this would have made very good sense to them. And then they would have looked for these external ideas of the way materiality manifests inside of their body. And of course, as soon as you start looking, you find them. And fire is what we call metabolism, right? Earth is the concrete aggregates primarily of minerals, okay? Bones, teeth, hair. Water is all the fluids in the body. Air is all the movements and all the inclinations to move in the body. All the rhythms, pulses, ticks, and so on. And air, all the empty spaces in the body. And not seeing it as a static system, but as a dynamic equilibrium where these elements are constantly shifting and who's dominant and which elements are interacting at a particular time according to the seasons and the whimsy of the external influences. And so they would have been very, very able, very completely able to correlate what they saw in nature with what they see in themselves. And there again, this has reinforced the saying, the slogan, the maxim, which we correlate with alchemy. Okay? It's actually Hermetic also, which is older than alchemy, I think. But as above, so below. That which is out reflects that which is in. That which is in is a reflection of that which is out. Okay, outer. The water cooled and in solid form became the foundation of earth. And from the earth, all of the organic and living beings received their substance. This includes all organic life from man and woman to the realms of animals, as well as the kingdom of plants and herbs. Earth is also the source or the origin of the inorganic substances found in nature and the mineral world. So in this fashion, all of the 5 elements, ether, air, fire, water, and earth, became manifest. Each of the 5 elements manifests in the operation of the physical body as a sense or as a faculty of cognition, as well as certain physical functions. All matter is composed from the interaction of all 5 of these elements. Water is the easiest to use. I'll go through a good explanation of that. And since all 5 elements originate in the realm of energy, or vibration emanating from cosmic consciousness, then all 5 are present in all matter in the manifested universe. Energy and matter are seen as variations and distinctions on the same continuum. On the same continuum. Energy elements and matter elements are two halves of the same whole. All right, that leads me to a statement. Okay, so I'll read this for you. I want you just to consider this for a second. Cosmic consciousness preceding manifestation leads us to a formula. Past actions or original inclinations, in Thai called kama or karma, precede energy elements, and energy elements precede physiology or matter elements. We could also say that acknowledgement precedes intention, intention precedes extension, affirmation precedes action, and action leads to manifestation. And so, if we understand the origin of the elements correctly, and their relationship to primordial consciousness, and the continuum is primordial consciousness, formation of elements with qualities, leading to manifestation of all that there is, then what we're saying is consciousness rules all. And that there's actually a continuum of manifestation from primordial, original, to relatively final or complete manifestation. And all forms of traditional medicine know this. And that's why puja is so important, for example. Because what we're saying is, puja is what's important. Everything else that we do in the middle is support for the manifestation of our intention, which we made in the puja. Now the four dhatu or elements of Thai Ayurveda or Tat Tang Si, we call Den Nam Phai Lo. Patavi dhatu, Apo dhatu, Teku dhatu, and Vayu dhatu. Okay? All right, let's start.